Ethan Carter wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to show up in Willow Creek, a peaceful suburb about 10 miles east of downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. Here, the winding streets are lined with ancient oak trees, neatly trimmed lawns, and charming red brick houses with cozy little porches where grandmas often sit knitting in the afternoons. It's the perfect picture of tranquility, where the loudest noise you might hear is probably the roar of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning. So, when Ethan quietly moved into house number 17 at the end of Willow Lane on a cool autumn day, no one thought he was the one who would shake up the neighborhood, or rather, shake up one specific person. Linda Hayes. Ethan stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with brown hair streaked with a few silver strands, and deep blue eyes that always held an enigmatic calm. He drove an old matte black Ford F-150, nothing flashy, but as sturdy as he was. As he opened the truck bed to unload his belongings, several cardboard boxes, a worn leather armchair, and a heavy metal toolbox, curious neighbors peeked through their window curtains. He's probably just a retired guy who likes to fix cars, Mr. Hal from number 15 whispered to his wife over their morning coffee. But Ethan was more than just a car enthusiast. He had been a top tactical engineer at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where he spent over 15 years designing systems that the Pentagon pretended didn't exist. Now, at 42, he craved a different life. Peaceful, reclusive, free from sleepless nights at the drafting table or 3 a.m. calls from commanders at Fort Bragg, 50 miles away. The house he chose is small, just 1,800 square feet, 1 story, with a gray-tiled roof and an unusually large garage that takes up almost half the lot. It's not the kind of house that makes anyone turn their head, but the garage is a different story. On the very first day, Ethan quietly moved in things that no one could see clearly: tightly locked metal boxes, thick coils of cable, and a steel door weighing at least 200 pounds that he personally installed into frame. That door isn't the kind you buy at Home Depot. It's reinforced steel, 2 inches thick, with a biometric lock that glimmers a faint blue every time Ethan places his finger on it. The neighbors didn't pay much attention, except for one. Linda Hayes, the president of the Willow Creek HOA, stood in her front yard 3 houses down, clipboard in hand, squinting as if she had just spotted a crack in the perfect facade of her neighborhood. Ethan didn't come here to draw attention. After years of working with DARPA, from laser defense systems for bases in Afghanistan to drones that could disable armored vehicles in under 90 seconds, he was exhausted. He had lived in rundown apartments near the DARPA headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, where the blaring horns and pressured deadlines were constant companions. Willow Creek was his chance to start fresh, to fix up a few old motorcycles, experiment with some personal projects, and most importantly, to keep his identity a secret. He built an 8-foot wooden fence around the backyard, installed heavy blackout curtains to cover the garage windows, and even planted some low shrubs to enhance his privacy. "Just keep everything calm," he told himself as he stood in the garage on his first night, holding a cup of black coffee, his eyes fixed on the tightly shut steel door. But that peace didn't last long. Ethan's garage wasn't just a storage space, it was a fortress. Inside, he had installed a laser tripwire running along the floor, just 6 inches high, but sensitive enough to detect any movement over 2 pounds. An infrared camera system scanned the entire 600 square feet, connected to a small tablet he always kept on him. On the shelves were gadgets he had crafted himself: a smart wrench that automatically adjusted torque based on vibrations, a small drone the size of a softball that could send out warning signals, and a few experimental armor plates he had once used to test bullet resistance in the Nevada desert. Everything was legal, licensed by DARPA in the city of Raleigh, but Ethan knew all too well, if anyone saw this, they wouldn't think it belonged to an ordinary mechanic. On the 3rd night after moving in, Ethan stood in the garage, the light from the overhead LED casting down onto the glossy epoxy floor. He powered up the system for the first time. A soft beep echoed as the laser grid activated, delicate red beams tracing a network across the floor. He smiled, feeling like he was back in the days at DARPA, but this time it was for himself. "This is going to be my place," he murmured, his hand gliding over a test steel plate. Little did he know, just 50 feet away behind the fence, Linda Hayes was standing under the shade of an oak tree, jotting something down on her clipboard, her eyes glinting with suspicion. For Linda, Ethan's silence wasn't peaceful, it was a challenge. and she wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. Ethan Carter wasn't the type to show off. At DARPA, he was often called the Invisible Man, not because he was quiet, but because the things he created often vanished from sight before anyone could even ask what they were. Once, he designed a mobile radar system that weighed less than 20 pounds, small enough to fit in a backpack, yet capable of detecting tanks from 5 miles away. That project now sits somewhere in a Pentagon warehouse, labeled Never Existed. Ethan liked it that way, working in the shadows, leaving his mark without anyone knowing his name. So, when he chose Willow Creek as his retirement spot, he wanted his garage to be just as invisible, a place to continue his passion, but where no one was allowed to step inside. Ethan's garage isn't just a repair shop. It's a living laboratory. Inside, the air is tinged with the smell of machine oil and burnt metal, mingling with a hint of mint from the ceramic stabilizer he uses to lubricate the equipment. He spent the entire first week in Willow Creek, turning this place into his own fortress. A 10-foot steel rack runs along the wall, filled with prototypes, from a tiny drone that can hover silently in the air for 12 hours, to a composite armor that's 30% lighter than Kevlar, which he tested at the 29 Palms base in California. On his workbench sits a 27-inch monitor connected to security system, infrared cameras, motion sensors, and a bright red tripwire laser grid stretched across the floor. He tested it last night, dropping a 1.6-ounce golf ball from a height of 3 feet, and immediately a beep echoed, the alarm light flashing on his tablet. This system is no joke. Ethan knew he was walking a fine line. Even though everything in the garage was licensed by DARPA and the city of Raleigh, he had the paperwork to prove it, complete with a big red stamp. He understood that a guy living in the suburbs shouldn't own anything that looked like tactical weaponry. Just keep everything under wraps, he told himself, gripping the now-cold coffee cup as he watched the camera feed scan the backyard. He had chosen Willow Creek because it was close to Fort Bragg, where he had once worked with the U.S. Marines, but far enough to avoid the prying eyes of the military. He wanted a normal life, fixing up a few old Harleys, sipping Budweiser on Friday nights, and maybe taking on some small projects for fun. But that garage, with its 2-inch thick steel door and glowing biometric lock, felt more like an invitation to trouble than a promise of peace. On the 4th night in Willow Creek, Ethan stood outside in the backyard, the chilly autumn wind blowing through the 8-foot wooden fence he had just built. He wore an old Carhartt jacket, holding a small flashlight, checking for any gaps. Everything seemed fine, except for one thing. He felt like someone was watching him, not the vague kind of feeling, but very real chill running down his spine, like when he'd been targeted by a sniper during training in Nevada. He turned off the flashlight, standing still in the darkness. His eyes scanned the oak trees 30 yards away. Nothing, just the sound of rustling leaves and the faint glow of streetlights from Willow Lane. Must be my imagination, he muttered, but his grip on the flashlight remained tight. He turned back to the garage, locking the door with a touch of his finger. The sharp click of the biometric lock echoed in the night. In fact, Ethan wasn't imagining things. 50 feet away, Linda Hayes stood under the shade of the largest oak tree in the neighborhood, a clipboard clutched tightly under her arm. Her eyes narrowed like a hunting cat. She wore a gray hoodie, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, and her white tennis shoes were stained with grass. Linda was not someone who overlooked details. She had been watching Ethan since the day he moved in. The way he quietly unpacked his things, not greeting anyone, and especially that strange garage of his. That steel door was anything but ordinary. What kind of lock glows in a place full of housewives and retired men? To Linda, Ethan was not just a new neighbor. He was a puzzle waiting to be solved. And Linda Hayes, with 5 years as a president of the Willow Creek HOA, had never failed to decode anyone. Ethan didn't know that. That night, he sat in the garage, playing an old Springsteen rock song through the Bluetooth speaker, holding a smart wrench he was testing out. He loved this feeling. The control, the quiet, and the space he had made his own. But when he looked up at the camera screen, a tiny was blinking in the southeast corner of the backyard. Not an alarm, just a faint motion signal, maybe a squirrel or a strong gust of wind. He shrugged, turned off the music, and double-checked the laser grid. Everything was fine. He didn't see Linda, didn't hear her footsteps quietly leaving, and certainly had no idea that his secret garage had just become her number one target. For Ethan, this was a hideout. For Linda, it was a declaration of war. And that war, whether you wanted it or not, had quietly begun under the shadows of Willow Creek. Linda Hayes is not the kind of person you want to run into on a bad day. At 48, she embodies control in the Willow Creek neighborhood of North Carolina, a woman with tightly pulled blonde hair, piercing brown eyes, and a forced smile that could make you question what you just did wrong. Standing at 5'6", Linda always appears with a hefty clipboard in hand, a Bic pen dangling from her collar, and tennis shoes so white they look freshly laundered. For her, Willow Creek isn't just a neighborhood, it's her own kingdom, where every lawn must be exactly 2 inches high, every trash can must weigh under 50 pounds when full, and every neighbor must adhere to rules she's enforced as HOA president for the past 5 years. So, when Ethan Carter moves into house number 17 at the end of Willow Lane, Linda doesn't see him as a neighbor, she sees him as a threat. On the first day Ethan showed up, Linda was already there. She stood in the front yard of her house 3 doors down, about 50 feet from Ethan's wooden fence, holding a 10-foot measuring tape, her eyes fixed on his mailbox. 3 inches too tall according to the rules, she muttered, jotting something down on her clipboard with the speed of an auditor. At that moment, Ethan was unloading items from his matte black Ford F-150, his strong hands lowering a heavy metal box to the ground. He looked up, saw Linda, and gave a slight, not a polite, greeting from someone who just wanted to be left alone. But Linda didn't respond. She stepped closer, her tennis shoes squeaking on the sidewalk, and stopped about 5 feet away from him. "I'm Linda Hayes, the HOA president," she said, her voice as stiff as oak. "Just wanted to check if your mailbox meets the standards. Neighborhood regulations, you know?" Ethan set the box down, wiped his hands on his old Carhartt jacket, and looked at her with a calm gaze. "I will comply with all regulations that don't violate the Constitution," he replied, his voice steady and devoid of sarcasm. Linda didn't smile. She glanced over his shoulder, her eyes landing on the garage door, a 2-inch thick steel barrier with a biometric lock glowing a faint blue. "What's inside there?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. "Tools," Ethan answered tersely, and he wasn't lying, just giving a response that left out half the truth. Linda frowned, the kind of frown that comes from catching a whiff of trouble. She jotted down another note on her clipboard, then turned away without saying anything more. But Ethan knew, from that moment on, that Linda wasn't the type to let him off the hook. For Linda, control is everything. She has turned Willow Creek into a well-oiled machine. The HOA meets every month at the community center 2 miles away, where she stands before 30 residents with a PowerPoint presentation listing every little violation, from trash cans left in the wrong spot to bushes taller than 4 feet. She once fined Mr. Hal at number 15 for leaving his bike lying sideways in the front yard, and made Sheila at number 19 replant her grass because the color wasn't uniform. Linda doesn't just manage, she dominates. But Ethan's garage, with its eerie silence and a steel door that no one can open, is something she cannot control. It's like a thorn in her side, a silent challenge that she is determined to uproot. The first week after Ethan moved in, Linda began her campaign. She emailed the HOA, reporting strange noises coming from house number 17, which was really just a faint buzzing from the battery stabilization system in the garage when Ethan was running tests at midnight. She stood outside his fence early in the morning, holding a cheap decibel meter she bought from Walmart, trying to capture sounds that didn't exceed 40 decibels, quieter than her own washing machine. "Something's not right," she whispered to herself, as if plotting her next move. Then she filed 2 more complaints. One about Ethan's 2 sturdy trash cans. They were 30-pound stainless steel. And another about his suspicious landscaping because he used gravel instead of the mandated with chips. Ethan received a warning letter from the HOA in his mailbox on Friday, but he just shrugged, tossed it in the trash, and went back to work in the garage. Linda didn't stop. She started hanging around Ethan's house more often. One afternoon, he saw her walking slowly past, pretending to text on her phone, but her eyes were darting toward the garage. Another time, she tossed a tennis ball over his 8-foot fence and knocked on the door, asking, "Can I come in and get it?" "It'll only take a minute." Ethan picked up the ball from the backyard, tossed it back over the fence, and said, "No need to thank me." Linda didn't thank him. She turned away, her lips pressed tight, her hand gripping the clipboard as if she wanted to snap it in half. To her, Ethan wasn't just a newcomer, he was an enemy who didn't play by her rules. On Saturday night, Linda stood beneath the large oak tree, 50 feet from Ethan's house, the dim streetlight casting a glow on her tense face. She had heard the faint beep from the garage the night before when Ethan was testing the laser grid, and it had kept her awake. "He's hiding something," she muttered, scribbling notes on her clipboard in a hurried scrawl. She had no idea that inside that garage were devices once approved by DARPA, things that could leave Fort Bragg in awe. For Linda, that wasn't the issue. To her, Ethan Carter was a mystery, and she despised mysteries. She would find a way in, no matter what it took. While Ethan sat in the garage, sipping coffee and listening to Springsteen, he had no clue that Linda had him in her sights. The battle hadn't begun yet, but the fuse had been lit, and Willow Creek, whether it wanted to or not, was about to become a battleground. It all started on a quiet Tuesday night in Willow Creek, when Ethan Carter thought he could finally relax. 2 weeks after moving in, he'd gotten used to the slow pace of the neighborhood, the morning birds singing, the kids on their bikes zooming down Willow Lane, and the steady hum of Mr. Hal's Lawnmower 3 houses down. He had tried to steer clear of trouble, ignoring the complaint emails from Linda Hayes and the time she lingered near his 8-foot wooden fence. Ethan thought his silence would make Linda lose interest and give up. He was wrong. That night, when the clock struck 2:03 a.m., a small beep from the tablet on his nightstand jolted him awake. The security system in the garage had just detected a break-in. Ethan shot up, reaching for his tablet, his eyes still stinging from sleep. The screen lit up, displaying the infrared camera feed from the garage, a 600-square-foot space he had turned into his own fortress. He squinted, trying to make sense of the bizarre scene before him. Linda Hayes, the president of the Willow Creek HOA, was crawling across the glossy epoxy floor, her body glistening with olive oil, if he wasn't mistaken. She wore a tight black outfit, a headlamp strapped on like a miner, dragging a purple yoga mat behind her like a makeshift sled. Linda was navigating a bright red laser tripwire, just 6 inches off the ground, at the pace of a determined turtle. Ethan plopped back down on the bed, mouth agape, unable to believe his eyes. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, zooming in on the image on the screen. Linda had slipped through the small dog door in the southeast corner of the garage gap. He hadn't got around to sealing up because, honestly, he didn't own a dog. That was his mistake. And Linda was making the most of it. She was mumbling something about unauthorized access and acid inspection as she crawled over a metal crate labeled, "Do not open unless you want to stop breathing." Ethan almost laughed, but the smile faded when he saw she was just an inch away from the main laser grid. If she touched it, a non-lethal riot control net design he had once tested for Marine raids at Fort Bragg would spring out, ensnaring her like a fly in a web. The system beeped for the second time, signaling it was locking onto the target. Ethan didn't want this to escalate. He had seen his equipment in action on the battlefield from the deserts of Nevada to bases in Afghanistan, but using them on a housewife in the suburbs of Raleigh was not part of the plan. He jumped out of bed, quickly threw on his Levi's jeans, and rushed out the back door, tablet still in hand. The cool night breeze swept through the backyard, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from Sheila's house just 100 feet away. He punched in the emergency code on the biometric lock. The sound of a whoosh echoed as the 200-pound steel door swung open and stepped into the garage just as Linda was slipping through the gap between 2 laser beams, a mere half-inch from the activation point. She couldn't see him. Linda was so focused, sweat trickling down her forehead, the flashlight on her head bobbing with every movement. Ethan stood still, arms crossed, watching this scene that was both hilarious and bizarre. Linda Hayes, the one who once sent him a detention letter for pebbles in the yard, now looked like a B-movie action agent, but clumsy enough to make him chuckle. She muttered louder, "I know you're hiding something, you jerk. Weapons, machinery, or something illegal." Her voice echoed in enclosed space, the system recording every word. Ethan shook his head, hand over his mouth to stifle his laughter. But then he realized. Linda had no idea she had just stepped into the safest place within a 50-mile radius, and was about to greet her in its own unique way. Ethan's security system was no mere toy. It was programmed for self-defense, with thermal cameras scanning Linda's body, cross-referencing it against a list of threats, which, humorously enough, now included a member of the HOA. A third beep echoed, and the riot net began to activate, red lights flashing on the control panel 10 feet away from him. Ethan had exactly 90 seconds to shut it down before Linda turned into a tangled mess of netting, olive oil, and yoga mats. He took a deep breath, stepped closer, his voice low but clear. Deactivate the system. Emergency code 719. The beeping stopped. The net halted 2 feet above the floor, and Linda, still oblivious, continued to crawl, mumbling about community safety. Ethan stood there, his shadow stretching long across the floor, wondering if Willow Creek was really the peaceful place he had always dreamed of. Ethan Carter stood in the shadows of the garage, less than 10 feet away from Linda Hayes, his breathing steady even though his heart raced faster than usual. The security system had just been disabled with an emergency code, the riot net hanging 2 feet above the floor, but Linda, still engrossed in her mission, had no idea she had just narrowly escaped a close call. She inched forward a few more inches, the purple yoga mat crackling on the epoxy floor, leaving a shimmering trail of olive oil glistening in the light from the LED fixture hanging 12 feet above. The flashlight mounted on her head beamed directly onto a metal rack holding Ethan's prototypes devices he had tested for DARPA, from tiny drones to composite armor. Linda paused, panting, and then she saw them. "Oh my God!" Linda exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement. She jumped up, completely forgetting about the laser grid just 6 inches from her knees, and pointed at the workbench. "I knew it. I knew you were making a bomb." Ethan tilted his head, arms still crossed over his chest, trying to suppress a smile. Linda pointed at a smart wrench, an adjustable tool that tightened based on vibration, weighing less than 2 pounds, and shouted, "What is that? A military weapon?" Ethan stepped closer, his gaze calm as if explaining to a child. "Take it easy," he said, his voice steady and low. "That's a smart wrench. It tightens bolts. It doesn't blow anyone up." But Linda wasn't listening. She was riding the high of her enthusiasm, her eyes wide in the flashlight's glow, her hands flailing like an actor fully immersed in a role. Everything was a chaotic mess. Linda spun around, trying to rush toward the dog door to escape, but her foot slipped on a puddle of olive oil she had created. She fell hard, her hand crashing into a heavy 30-pound toolbox, causing it to topple loudly onto the floor. A tactical helmet rolled out, the LED light on top flickering to life, scanning her face with an infrared beam. "Target identified." A robotic voice echoed from the helmet, and Linda screamed, backing away from the rack as if it were about to explode. Ethan quickly stepped forward, pressing the off button on the helmet before it could activate the strobe light, something he had used to distract during tests at Fort Bragg. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm, yet still maintaining his usual calm demeanor. Linda didn't give up. She got back on her feet, sliding once more on the slick floor, her hands gripping the railing to keep her balance. "This is a serious violation," she shouted, her voice wavering with panic. "No one is allowed to have equipment like this except the government." Ethan raised an eyebrow, stepping closer, his shadow blocking the light from the LED. "I used to work for the government," he said slowly. "You just broke into a federally regulated lab. Congratulations." Linda blinked, her mouth opening as if to argue, but then she slipped again, this time smashing her knee against a 15-pound test steel plate. She groaned, clutching her leg, but her eyes still shot daggers of anger. Ethan sighed. He didn't want any of this. He came to Willow Creek to avoid trouble, not to turn his garage into a stage for a crazy housewife. But Linda had crossed the line. He stepped forward, helping her up, even though she immediately pulled away, and pointed to the dog door 20 feet away. "You have 10 seconds to get out," he said, his voice as cold as steel. "If not, I'll call the Raleigh police for breaking and entering. That a felony." Linda stood frozen, her breath heavy, olive oil smeared all over her shirt, her hair a tangled mess under the flashlight. She opened her mouth to argue, But then her gaze landed on a small drone on the shelf, the thing buzzing softly as if mocking her. Something in Ethan's tone, or maybe it was that drone, made her fall silent. Linda turned around, crawling backward to the dog door faster than she had come in, leaving behind her yoga mat and a long 10-foot trail of oil on the floor. She mumbled something, "The association will deal with you," before disappearing into the shadows of the backyard. Ethan stood there, watching her go, his hand rubbing his face in disbelief at what had just happened. He locked the dog door with a thick 1-inch steel plate, cranked the security system up to its highest setting, and headed back inside the house. The garage fell silent again, with only a faint hum coming from the control panel 5 feet away. He sat down in a chair, holding a cup of cold coffee, his eyes staring up at the ceiling. Linda wasn't your average thief. She was a headache that could put both him and her in the crosshairs of people he had once worked with at DARPA. As Ethan lay down to sleep that night, the tablet on his nightstand still glowed, displaying Linda's voice recording. "I know you're hiding something, you jerk." He shook his head, turned it off, and settled in. But a thought flickered through his mind. Linda wouldn't back down. She believed she was protecting Willow Creek, but she had no idea she was poking a hornet's nest. The garage wasn't just Ethan's hideout. It was a machine, and he was the one in control. This confrontation, no matter how amusing it seemed, was just the beginning. Linda wanted war, and Ethan, whether he liked it or not, would have to respond. After that night, when Linda Hayes crawled out of Ethan Carter's garage covered in olive oil and left the yoga mat behind, Willow Creek was no longer the peaceful place it once was. Ethan thought that the shock would make Linda back down, that she would realize she had gone too far by breaking into a place that didn't belong to her. But he had underestimated her stubbornness. For Linda, the failure in the garage wasn't the end, it was a spark that ignited an all-out war. She didn't just want to prove that Ethan was hiding something. She wanted the entire neighborhood to rally behind her, turning him into a common enemy. And Ethan, whether he liked it or not, was forced to respond in his own way. The next morning, Ethan stood on the porch, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, his eyes fixed on the faint oil slick that Linda had left on the walkway 20 feet away. He wore an old Carhartt jacket, the crisp autumn breeze rustling through the 8-foot wooden fence he had built around the backyard. Linda appeared at the end of Willow Lane, 50 yards away, wearing a large baseball cap and oversized sunglasses, perhaps more for drama than to shield herself from the sun. She didn't say a word, just stood there with her arms crossed, staring at him as if he had just set the whole neighborhood ablaze. Ethan took a sip of his coffee and nodded in greeting like he did every day, but deep down he knew Linda wasn't here to make peace. She was here to declare war. Just a few hours later, Linda started spreading rumors. She called each member of the HOA, her voice trembling as if she had just escaped an explosion. "I saw weapons in his garage," she told Sheila at number 19, who was sipping tea in her armchair 2 miles away. "Bombs, military machinery. This whole neighborhood is in danger." Sheila frowned and replied, "Are you sure? I only saw him working on his car." But Linda didn't need the truth. She needed suspicion. By noon, the rumor spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Mr. Howell at number 15 whispered to his wife that Ethan might be a Russian spy, while the housewives at the community center began eyeing the house at number 17 with wary glances. Ethan learned about it through an email from the HOA late in the afternoon. Subject: community safety concerns. The content was a brief notice about an emergency meeting on Friday night, accompanied by the bolded line: proposal to inspect the garage at 17 Willow Lane to remove unregistered machinery. Ethan sat in the garage, tablet in hand, his eyes glued to the camera scanning the expansive 600-square-foot backyard. He shook his head, letting out a dry laugh. "Inspect my garage, huh?" he muttered, running his fingers over the heavy 2-pound smart wrench on the table. She has no idea who she's messing with. But he wasn't planning to sit back and take it. If Linda wanted to play, he would play by his own rules. The meeting on Friday night took place at the community center, a low building with red brick walls located 2 miles from Ethan's house. Inside, 30 residents sat on folding plastic chairs, the fluorescent lights illuminating the name tags dangling from their chests, even though everyone knew each other. Linda stood in front of the PowerPoint projector, remote in hand, her face tense like a general about to go into battle. The first slide appeared. "Who is Ethan Carter?" in bold red letters, with huge Comic Sans font. She began her presentation, her voice high-pitched. "He has military equipment in his garage. I saw bombs, helmets, and something that looks like a combat drone." A few people chuckled, but Linda remained undeterred. She pointed at Ethan, who was sitting comfortably in the back row, arms crossed over his chest. "Ask him. Ask what he's hiding." Ethan stood up, towering at 6'2", his voice deep and steady like granite. "What do you want to check my garage for?" "A secret army of robots." Laughter erupted from a few people. Linda flushed, but she shot back. "Don't play dumb. I've seen illegal stuff." Ethan shrugged, stepping forward with his hands shoved in the pockets of his Levi's jeans. "No one goes into my garage but me," he said. "It's a lab licensed by DARPA and the city of Raleigh. Want to check it out? Call the cops. But don't expect me to open the door for you." He sat back down, leaving Linda standing there, gripping the remote tightly, her eyes blazing with anger. Linda didn't call the police, not yet. Instead, she took matters into her own hands by hiring someone. 3 days later, Ethan was sitting at home, sipping on a cold Budweiser, when the tablet on the table beeped. The front yard camera showed 3 guys in black, wearing hastily printed badges from a home printer, walking up to his front door. They were a private security team from a rapid response company on Craigslist, 10 miles outside of Raleigh. The tallest one, weighing about 200 pounds, knocked politely. "We're here to check your garage," he said, his voice slightly shaky. Ethan opened the door, offering a faint smile. "Come on in," he said, gesturing toward the garage 15 feet away. "But don't blame me if you don't like what you see." 10 minutes later, the 3 guys sat on the lawn chairs in the garage, cans of Coke in hand, their eyes glued to the 27-inch screen replaying footage of them walking into the yard like a documentary. Ethan pointed at the bright red laser tripwire on the floor. "You guys almost got caught in the riot net," he said, his tone light. "Made for the special ops, not for the neighbors." One guy chuckled, while the other whispered, "Oh man, she didn't say anything about this." They left after 20 minutes, asking to take a selfie with Ethan, promising to refund Linda, but Linda didn't back down. She filed a lawsuit in small claims court in Raleigh, accusing Ethan of creating a security disturbance and threatening the community. Ethan received a subpoena on Monday morning, standing on the porch, paper in hand, eyes fixed on Linda's house 50 yards away. He knew she wouldn't give up, but neither would he. Ethan Carter stood on the porch of 17 Willow Lane, holding the summons from Linda Hayes, as the early morning sun filtered to the oak trees 50 yards away. A gentle autumn breeze carried the scent of dry grass from Sheila's yard at 19, but the air around him felt heavy, like before a storm. Linda had taken him to small claims court in Raleigh, accusing him of disturbing the peace and threatening the community. Charges that sounded like they were written by someone who had just binge-watched too many action movies. Ethan smirked, tossed the paper onto the kitchen table, and walked into the garage. He knew Linda wouldn't back down after a failure with the private security team. She was just stepping up her game. But Ethan wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated. The day of the trial arrived like a whirlwind. The small courthouse in downtown Raleigh, just 10 miles from Willow Creek, was a low brick building with a narrow courtroom and old wooden benches spaced 6 feet apart. Ethan, dressed in a white shirt and Levi's jeans, sat in the defendant's row, arms crossed over his chest, his calm eyes fixed on Linda, standing at the podium. She wore a gray suit, clutching a thick stack of documents that looked like it had been chewed on by a dog, her voice piercing as she began, "He's building battle robots. He's turned me into a national security threat." The judge, a lanky man in his 60s, pushed his glasses down and asked, "Where's your evidence?" Linda replied, "It's common sense. Who else has a garage full of equipment like that?" Ethan stood up, towering at 6'2", his voice deep like granite. He placed a stack of papers on the table. Security footage from the garage, a permit from DARPA, a confirmation letter from the city of Raleigh, and the activity log of the homemade drone Linda had used to spy on him, a system that had recorded everything from 2 weeks ago. "Ms. Hayes broke into my property," he said, pointing at the tablet screen displaying footage of Linda crawling to the dog door, olive oil glistening under the flashlight. This is a legitimate lab. She just didn't like that I wouldn't let her in for a check. The judge reviewed the documents for 5 minutes, then looked up. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice dry, "not only is this case baseless, but you should also be careful when trespassing in places like this." He rapped the gavel. "Dismissed." Linda opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of the gavel falling silenced her. Ethan stepped out of the courthouse, sunlight hitting his face, a wave of relief washing over him. But he knew Linda wouldn't back down. She wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the kind of person who would burn the whole neighborhood down to prove she was right. Sure enough, just 2 days later, Linda held a Q&A in her backyard, only 50 yards from Ethan's house. She invited 15 neighbors, set up a 5-foot whiteboard, and scrawled the words, "Danger in the neighborhood." She handed out hastily printed flyers from her home printer, claiming Ethan owned weapons of war and a spy drone. "I heard an explosion," she shouted. Even though it was just Ethan testing a sound barrier at a volume of less than 60 decibels, quieter than her washing machine. Ethan didn't show up for the meeting. He sat in the garage, holding a cup of black coffee, his eyes scanning the 27-inch screen that overlooked the backyard. The camera captured Linda standing on the podium, her arms waving like a fervent preacher. He let out a dry chuckle, but the smile faded when his tablet beeped. A strange signal appeared near the shed roof, just 20 feet from the garage, a tiny homemade drone, weighing less than a pound, stuck under the eaves. Ethan stepped outside, grabbed a 10-foot pole to knock it down, and disassembled it in 10 minutes. Inside was a slip of paper. "I'm watching you. HOA won't overlook this." He shook his head, tossed the drone into the trash, but deep down he knew Linda had just crossed the line from annoying to dangerous. That night, Ethan called Major Daniel Torres, an old buddy from the U.S. Marine Corps, now working for the NSA about 50 miles from Fort Bragg. He spilled everything over the phone, from the break-in to the drone. Torres laughed loudly through the speaker, his voice booming like when they used to test equipment in Afghanistan. "She thinks she can take you on?" Torres said, "Let me help. I'll bring a few people over. Put on a little show, legal, educational, but enough to make her sweat." Ethan nodded, even though Torres couldn't see him. "Go for it," he said, "but keep it under wraps." Torres agreed, and the plan began to take shape. Linda, meanwhile, had no idea what she had just set in motion. She stood in her yard, 50 feet away from Ethan's fence, her eyes fixed on the garage with a smug smile. She thought she was winning. The rumors were spreading. The lawsuit failure was just a temporary setback, and her drone was a clever strike. But Ethan was no longer playing defense. He sat in the garage, his hand gliding over the 15-pound composite shield, his eyes locked on the bright red laser tripwire grid on the floor. Linda wanted a war, and he was going to show her who he really was. Not with fists, but with what he did best: preparation. This battle was about to reach its peak, and Willow Creek would never forget it. After the phone call with Major Daniel Torres, Ethan Carter realized that his battle with Linda Hayes was coming to a head, but not in the peaceful way he had hoped for when he moved to Willow Creek. Linda had taken things too far, from breaking into garage, spreading rumors, hiring people, to lawsuits and sending drones to spy. She thought she had the upper hand, but Ethan, with Torres' support, was ready to turn his top-secret garage into his final strike. Not for revenge, but to prove that he wasn't someone she could toy with. The security demonstration that Torres proposed was the pivotal move and was set to take place on a bright Saturday afternoon in Willow Creek, less than 2 miles from Ethan's home. The plan was meticulously prepared. Torres contacted a licensed contractor in Raleigh, specializing in collaborating with cities on security technology, and obtained permission to hold a community safety demonstration under the guise of testing new technology, which the city approved within 24 hours. Ethan spent the entire week in the garage, wielding a heavy 2-pound adjustable wrench, fine-tuning every device, from a bright red laser tripwire grid on the floor to the tiny drone that could signal from 5 miles away. He didn't want to show off, but Torres convinced him, "You've got to make it impressive, so she sees just how wrong she was." Ethan agreed. even though deep down, all he wanted was a return to the peaceful days of fixing Harley bikes and sipping Budweiser. The performance took place in a small park at the end of Willow Lane, just 200 yards from Ethan's house. Neighbors gathered with folding lawn chairs, plastic cups filled with lemonade, an overly enthusiastic guy hauling a 3-foot portable barbecue grill to cook hot dogs. Linda arrived late, wearing a gray hoodie, oversized sunglasses, and clutching a clipboard like it was her last line of defense. She blended into a crowd of 40 people, squinting when she spotted Torres 6 feet tall, dressed in a black polo, with an NSA badge glinting on his chest, stepping out a shiny black Chevy Suburban parked about 50 feet away. Next to him were 3 contractors, carrying shiny equipment. A self-locking door resembling Ethan's garage, a drone detection system, and a tiny robot no bigger than a Roomba. Torres began, his voice echoing like it did when they were testing equipment in Afghanistan. "Today we're introducing civilian security technology," he said, gesturing to the heavy 200-pound steel door. "It's meant to protect workshops, data, or homes. Completely legal and safe." The crowd nodded. A few people clapped. Linda smirked, whispering something to Sheila standing next to her, but no one could hear clearly. Then Torres moved on to the drone detection system. He powered it up, a beep sounded, and the screen lit up a familiar signal. Linda's homemade drone, weighing less than a pound, had been captured 3 days ago. "We detected a device like this recently," Torres said, his tone calm yet chilling. "Rudimentary design, illegal if armed, that's a serious offense." Linda went pale, retreating deeper into the crowd, her hand gripping the clipboard tightly. The climax arrives when Ethan steps up. Torres introduces him as a former technical advisor with extensive security experience. Not the whole truth, but enough to make an impression. Ethan holds a remote control, standing 6 feet 2, his deep voice steady. "This is what I do in my garage." He presses a button, and a small platform rises 2 feet from the ground, revealing a robot the size of a softball. It extends its tiny arm, waving to the crowd, then projects a hologram. "Neighborhood Watch 2.0. Gasps fill the air, a few kids scream in delight, and a small yelp escapes from Linda's spot. She nearly falls into Mr. Howe's lawn chair. Ethan doesn't look at her. He doesn't need to. He can feel her collapse through the air. Torres concluded by handing the HOA board a thick packet, the highest security certification for Ethan's garage, complete with charts and praise from the NSA. "Few people use their experience to protect a neighborhood like you, Carter," Torres said, patting Ethan on the shoulder. The crowd erupted in applause, with a few people shouting, "Awesome." Linda said nothing. She quietly slipped away, stepping into the park restroom and not coming out for 30 minutes. Ethan stood there, holding a glass of lemonade, his eyes watching the crowd gradually disperse. He didn't want to win like this. Flashy, loud, but Linda had forced his hand. She thought the garage was his weakness. She was wrong. It was his strength, and now all of Willow Creek knew it. As night fell, Ethan sat in the garage, his hand gliding over the 15-pound composite armor, his eyes fixed on the bright red laser grid on the floor. The tablet beeped. Linda was trying to unlock the biometric system again at midnight, but the system denied her access, illuminating her face with a message. "Access denied. Go home, Linda." Ethan chuckled, the first time in weeks. Linda had lost not just to him, but to the entire neighborhood she once controlled. The climax had passed, and the victory, though quiet, belonged to him. The moonlight poured down on Willow Creek, casting a silver glow over Willow Lane and the house at number 17, where Ethan Carter stood on the porch, holding a cup of cold coffee. The security show had wrapped up a few hours ago, but its echoes still lingered in the air. The park, just 200 yards away, was now quiet, with only a few folding chairs left behind and the faint smell of grilled sausages wafting from the enthusiastic neighbor's 3-foot-long barbecue. Linda Hayes hadn't shown up since slipping into the park restroom, and Ethan knew she wouldn't be back. At least not tonight. She had lost, not just to him, but to the whole neighborhood that had once seen her as a rule enforcer. Ethan stepped into the garage, the light from the LED bulb hanging 12 feet above illuminating the glossy epoxy floor. He sat down in a chair, his eyes scanning the bright red laser tripwire stretching across 600 square feet of system that had once sent Linda into a panic. The tablet on the table beeped softly, displaying the last recorded image, Linda's face at midnight, glowing under the biometric lock light. With the words, "Come home, Linda." He let out a dry laugh, his hand brushing over the 15-pound composite armor resting on the shelf. He never wanted things to go this far. When he moved to Willow Creek, all he wanted was to fix his Harley, sip on Budweiser, and leave his DARPA past behind. But Linda had pulled him into the fight, and he, with the help of Major Daniel Torres, had triumphed using what he did best, preparation. That night, Ethan received a message from Torres, just one word, checkmate. He smiled and replied, "Thanks, buddy." The garage fell silent again, with only a faint humming from the control panel 5 feet away. He stood up, locked a heavy 200-pound steel door, and turned back into the house. Linda might not give up completely, she wasn't the type to let go easily, but after today, she was no longer a threat. The whole of Willow Creek had seen that his garage wasn't a bomb shelter, but a sanctuary, a fortress not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. Ethan lay down on the bed, feeling a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. The climax had passed, and though he hadn't sought victory, it had come quietly and surely, just like him, after a security presentation that left Linda Hayes speechless as she exited Willow Creek Park. Ethan Carter thought everything would return to normal, the kind of normal he had dreamed of since moving to the neighborhood 2 months ago. But normal on Willow Lane now held a different meaning. His garage, once a hidden fortress with a heavy 200-pound steel door and blazing red laser tripwires, was no longer a secret. It had become a symbol not of the threat Linda had once proclaimed, but of protection, creativity, and something greater than Ethan himself. The battle with Linda was over, but his journey here was just beginning. The morning after the show, Ethan stood on the porch, holding a cup of black coffee, watching the kids ride their bikes about 20 feet away. The autumn breeze rustled through the 30-foot-tall oak trees lining Willow Lane, carrying the scent of dry grass and a hint of smoke from last night's barbecue, still lingering in the park 200 yards away. He wore an old Carhartt jacket, feeling a mix of relief and surprise as Mr. Hal from number 15 approached, carrying a steaming tray of barbecue that weighed about 5 pounds. "Thanks for yesterday," he said, his voice raspy. "I want to install a camera outside the garage. Can you help me with that?" Ethan nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Sure thing. Bring over some beer and I'll do it for free." Mr. Hal let out a hearty laugh. The first time since Ethan moved in. Then Sheila from number 19 showed up, the one who had complained to him about the stones in the yard. She was wearing a red sweater, holding her phone, her voice a bit shy. "What do you think about a potluck? To thank you and, to bring the neighborhood closer together." Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't refuse. "Sure thing," he said, "but don't expect me to bake any pies." Sheila laughed, turning away with a light step. In just a few days, all of Willow Creek transformed. The potluck took place over the weekend, with a 10-foot folding table overflowing with food, sausages, mashed potatoes, and tiny drone-shaped cupcakes made by a creative mom. Ethan sat on the grass, holding a paper plate, his eyes scanning the crowd of 50 people chatting and laughing, a scene he had never imagined when he came here to hide away. The HOA council also showed up, not with a clipboard or a fine letter, but with a thick piece of paper, handing it to Ethan in front of everyone. HOA Honorary Protector. The words read, along with the Keeper of Tactical Rules. It was silly, but it was full of emotion. The president of the council, a short man with glasses, whispered to him, "We've changed the rules. No more garage checks, no more drone surveillance. You made her quiet, and we're grateful for that." Ethan nodded, his hand gently gripping the paper, a strange feeling welling up inside him. He hadn't come here to change the neighborhood, but somehow he had done just that. Linda Hayes, meanwhile, had vanished from sight. Her house was 50 yards away from Ethan, with the curtains drawn tight and the lights off for 3 days straight. Rumors spread quickly. She had taken a leave of absence for health reasons from the HOA, or the council had forced her to leave after the drone incident. Ethan didn't care much. He just wanted peace, and now he had it, in a different way. A week later, a letter from the Raleigh Public Safety Commissioner arrived, inviting him to join the Civilian Advisory Board on integrating security technology into urban planning. "You should take it," Major Daniel Torres texted, his laughter echoing through the phone. "They need someone like you." Ethan glanced at the letter, then looked at the garage through the window. Once a place of escape, now a source of inspiration. He replied, "All right." 3 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in front of Linda's house. She sold it quickly and moved to a gated neighborhood in West Raleigh, where the HOA was managed by a retired judge, probably the only place that could handle her kind of oversight. A young couple bought her house, bringing a 2-pound tray of cookies and asking, "Can you install a motion sensor light?" Ethan laughed, accepted the cookies, and nodded. "No clipboard needed," he said. They all laughed heartily, not quite getting the joke, but stayed to chat for an hour. Willow Creek was now home, not just for him, but for everyone. Time passed, and Willow Creek gradually adjusted to its new peace. A peace that no longer bore the shadow of Linda Hayes and her menacing clipboards. Ethan Carter stood in the front yard of house number 17, holding a cup of black coffee, his eyes tracking a drone circling the park 200 yards away. It wasn't his drone. It belonged to a 15-year-old kid who watched the security demonstration, now giving him a thumbs up from afar. Ethan nodded back, a smile flickering across his face. The garage behind him, with its heavy 200-pound steel door and bright red laser tripwire inside, was no longer a hideout. It had become the heart of community he had unwittingly bonded with. Ethan opened a side entrance to the garage, transforming 200 square feet into a small demo space for the neighbors. He taught the kids basic drone programming, helped Mr. House set up a security camera, and even let Sheila take a shot at controlling the little 2-foot robot that once freaked Linda out. The HOA, surprisingly, dipped into the landscaping fund to buy equipment, unofficially, but enough to turn it into a community workshop. One cool evening, Ethan stood outside in the yard, a cold Budweiser in hand, watching the kids run to the sensor sprinkler he had set up near the mailbox, something he jokingly called Linda's Cloud, spraying colorful mist whenever someone got close. They laughed loudly, and he laughed along, feeling like he was reclaiming something he didn't even know he had lost. Linda thought she could break him when she broke into the garage 2 months ago, believing she would expose a dark secret. But she was wrong. She awakened a side of Ethan that even he had forgotten, a man who not only knew how to build machines, but also how to build trust. She tried to control the situation with panic, but Ethan triumphed with calmness and precision, just as he had done at DARPA. The garage was no longer a lonely fortress. It was proof that sometimes the strongest person isn't the one who screams the loudest. Ethan took a sip of his beer, his eyes fixed on the sunset descending over Willow Lane. He had come here to escape, but now he stayed to belong. Linda had lost, not just to him, but to the entire neighborhood she once ruled. And every time garage door opened, it reminded everyone, including her, if she dared to look back, that messing with the wrong person could turn you into a loser, caught in a web of olive oil, laser beams, and your own arrogance. Willow Creek was home, and Ethan, at last, was a part of it. Thank you for joining us on the inspiring journey of Ethan Carter here on Legendary Narratives. From a recluse in a garage to the hero of Willow Creek, Ethan has shown us the power of perseverance and creativity, even when facing crazy challenges like Linda Hayes. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming stories. We hope you leave with a bit of motivation, that sometimes it's the small battles that shape your greatness. Thanks for being here. You all are amazing. We'll see you in the next video. Stay tough, stay proud, and see you soon. From the Legendary Narratives team, goodbye for now and see you next time.